So I'm going to try my best to go through these in the order that we've got them. So there's a question from Terry Hegarty. Could we ask Cal Mike for a considered response to Professor Alf's insights?
Who do you want to answer that?
I guess it's for you, Joe.
Well, I suppose to explain where we've got to, I mean, in terms of process, the first gatekeeper in this is CMAL, who are the vessel owning company. So the first, and we've got to that point, and then of course CalMac are of course a key in this. This has got to be a ferry that they are happy to run and meets their needs. Yeah, they're aware of this, and we will be talking to them at greater length with them soon, but they're certainly aware of this. I mean, our main contact so far has been with Transport Scotland and CMAL. So in terms of procedure, the first people to be engaged are CMAL, and they are.
Okay, I just wonder if Alf's got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's always valuable to see what the response is. But I think the difficulty is in Scotland, of course, is that there's a whole range of decision makers here. As Joe alluded to, there's also CMAL, there's also Transport Scotland, and there's also the RMT, which you have to think about here. So there's a whole range of groups, and that is partly one of the major, if I might say so, constraints in decision making. Is there's a whole range of groups, and we get basically ship specifications and designs by committee, whereas where normally a shipping operator is one entity, especially in the private sector, but not always. But so it's one entity, one decision-making process. Here we've got a whole range of decision-making process, and then you've got over and above these four entities, you have what we might call other key stakeholders: local authorities, tourist agencies, freight bodies. Everybody has an opinion on ferries in Scotland, what we call lifeline services. So the decision-making process is very complex and very laborious and very time-consuming, and as we can see, never results in an optimal outcome. So we have a dilemma there. Decision-making somehow has to be streamlined into as few agencies or bodies or organizations as possible, and try to get a kind of, if you like, private sector mentality, in the sense of how do we develop the best service we can at not at the lowest cost, but at reasonable cost, that provides island communities with what they want, which is high frequency, high reliability, flexibility, and just a very seamless kind of connection that's possible to do. So I think that's the challenge, is how it's not just CalMac, it's a whole myriad of agencies and organizations that come into this that add to the complexity. It's how to overcome that complexity and get to a streamlined decision making.
Okay, I just realized that Terry actually asked a closed question, and I think the answer to the question is yes. So Terry was off the mark quickly with a few questions. The next one, I think I'm going to direct to Joe again. Are there Mull scale, in other words, are there any electric, hydrogen or hybrid catamarans in service or in the pipeline which are suitable for the Mull scale of operation?
How much time have you got?
About a minute.
Okay, right. Well, the answer is, I mean, I touched on this, but the greening, if you like, of shipping generally, ferries in particular, is the next frontier, if you like, and it's a frontier that Norway have already crossed. They are committed to making their entire ferry fleet zero emission by 2035. They are already well on the way to that. They are about to deploy hydrogen-powered vessels to the Lofoten Islands, which is one of the longer routes. Any route that is up to about an hour in duration, so i.e. similar to Oben-Kragenja, is well within the capacity of a battery electric propulsion system. And that is exactly what is being deployed all across Norway at the moment. And they have, they have a domestic industry now for propulsion systems, battery systems, and battery electric ferries, where all of their domestic ferry fleet is becoming zero emission battery electric. And we could and we should do exactly the same. Okay.
So I think, again, the short answer to Terry's question is yes, there are. Thanks, Joe. A question from Nigel Judson. Smaller high-speed passenger boat for Mull residents. I presume what Nigel's meaning there is passenger only.
Yeah, so that's an oft mooted suggestion, is that rather than running one ferry with fixed passenger capacity of 1,000 as we have now, when that passenger capacity, even when newly built in the late 80s, was only required on a very small number of sailings, that the 10 o'clock ex Oben and the 5 o'clock ex Mull was when those vast numbers of day trip passengers needed that capacity. There are more efficient ways of providing that capacity than having that huge amount of steel added to the one fixed ferry and the big crew costs that go along with it, than all year long, for the sake of those very relatively small number of sailings where you have those bigger passenger numbers. So yes, the answer, one of the solutions, commercial and value for money solution, is to have a passenger only ferry operating alongside your main vehicle roll-on roll-off ferry. Gives you more flexibility, and it gives you the ability to meet those peaks in demand rather than have a very large fixed cost in your main ferry. In short, yes.
Okay, thank you.
If I say anything wrong or you disagree with Alf, shout.
Well, all I can add is that it's normal practice in Norway to have passenger catamarans, high-speed passenger catamarans supporting conventional speed monohull ferries, and also catamarans in Norway, and that's been normal process for some years. I remember studying the Norwegian system some years ago when there were 300 ferries that we counted in Norway. This was some years ago, of which 200 were medium speed and 100 were high-speed catamarans for fjord runs going to towns and cities, mainly in the summer period. But this supported the main car ferries, and that's been common practice in Norway for many years. The other aspect about hybrid operations, because the catamaran requires half the power of the monohull, the comparison I showed, it means that the catamaran gets very close to the largest battery-powered ferry in service at the moment, which is around 4 megawatts completely on battery, whereas the monohulls would struggle to get close to that. So I think you're already in the area, as Joe said, where we can get to hybrid operations, and a route like Mull should surely have that now.
Absolutely.
Okay. I have a question from Ewan, which I'm wanting to bring in our man on Iona, if he's still with us. So question for Finlay here. It seems incontrovertibly proved that transporting people and vehicles by ferry is a lot more costly than by road. If that's so, why not serve Mull and Tyree by a ferry from somewhere on Mull, like Benesson?
I'm not going to put my video on because every time I put it on, my thing freezes. So fortunately, you don't have to look at my ugly mug either. So I understand the concept. The problem being, for example, Benesson is not a deep water port. Finnafurt, where the ferry goes to Iona, is not a deep water port. And for the boat that would be required to go out to Mull and Tyree, the infrastructure isn't there. Now, obviously, you could build infrastructure. We're currently looking at improvements to both the Iona slipway and the Finnefort, what will effectively be a sort of harbour in Finnefort, but they're not. It's not deep enough in the sound of Iona to take big passenger vessels. You do get cruise ships that come in fairly close, and something like the Hebridean Princess, which I'm sure most folk will be familiar with the size of that, has managed to go through the sound at high tide, but it's not really designed. It's not really ideal for big vessels. Benesson, again, very tidal. There might be other spots down the south end, but it could be, if you're going to Colm Tyree, that actually the north end of the island might be a more effective way of shuttling across. If you're using land bridges, then possibly the north end, Dervig, Croig, somewhere like that, or possibly even from Tobermory. It does make a difference. I'm sure I've read it somewhere, the comparison of the boats going up the Sound of Mull in carbon footprint. It's significantly lower if everybody was to get off in Craigmere and drive to Tobermory and get picked up by a boat there. So it definitely does make sense, but I'm not sure the south end of the island is the option.
I think the principle is an interesting one, in that you know, our ferry network now is a historical artifact in many cases, in that, you know, and is quite right to point out that, you know, neighbouring islands, Colm and Tyree, have no direct ferry links with Mull, and that is ridiculous. It's mad. If the general principle, without talking about, you know, specifics of routes and so on, but the general principle of cheaper to run smaller, flexible ferries and more of them gives you more options to run different services and to reconnect services where they weren't before. That, you know, so and there's always a compromise between you know, raw efficiency of network and connecting the best places. So but the general principle is that more ferries, smaller, is gives you more flexibility.
Just to follow up, Matt, there is certainly the option, if you were to do it, if it was passenger only. You know, what I was describing was, you know, could Isle of Mull come to Finnefort to pick up people? The answer is no. But clearly, Tyree is like 15 miles from the back of Iona. It's an hour away in the boats that I use going to Staffa. So, you know, it is ridiculously close, but yet ridiculously far away if you have to use public transport. Like going from Iona to Tyree is an overnight both ways in Oban. So I understand the concept, and you could certainly do it by passenger only, but I think if you're looking for a vehicle movement, you're looking at a much bigger boat and much more infrastructure required.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Sally Campbell. Is the overfull instances that Joe referred to due to RET, amazingly cheap travel for cars, etc.? So, Alf, I wonder if you could just share your thoughts with us on that.
Well, the prices have become more attractive with RET, which is pretty obvious. But I think what's more important in ferry research, which I've looked at in other countries such as Greece and Italy, what comes out as the most important criteria for ferry operations is frequency. And frequency in these surveys is regarded as more important than price. So while price is important, it's not the most important factor. Frequency is, which also provides for reliability, is often the key feature. And frequency you can get through either more vessels or faster vessels or a longer operating day and so on. So there's different ways to provide frequency, but what we don't see in Scotland with the major ship routes is where you've got most of the time one large vessel on a given route, it doesn't provide the frequency. And this is one of the great lessons we have in Scotland from Western Ferries operation on the Clyde, where they have 4 vessels. And we see it throughout the Norwegian system, where fjords have, in some cases, 3, 4 more vessels on a single route and running all day, providing high frequency. And it's not necessarily the price. Price is important for driving up demand, but the key driver of demand in ferry operations, I would say, is frequency.
Certainly, I mean, obviously, the carryings have gone up a lot since the introduction of RET, and it's one of the great improvements of recent times is that we do have fares that are far more affordable now. But there wasn't the planning around the introduction of RET to cope with that. I mean, the fact that we have a ferry that was built in 1988 when fares were nothing like as affordable, and we kind of have a hodgepodge arrangement of this, old and inappropriate and large ferry alongside one of the smallest ferries in the network, desperately trying to keep up with the demand that was generated. The fares are a great thing in most respects, but obviously the problem is the lack of capacity is a real problem, and it's worst on Mull. We have the most congested service. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to try and get back on point, which is talking about the possibility of a catamaran for the Creignier-Oban route, and I'm always careful to call it the Creignier-Oban route to make sure that it's an island-focused title that it has. So I've got a question, and I'm not sure who this is from, but it says the Pentalina has already been reviewed by CMAL, who declined to purchase it. Has the committee approached Pentland Ferries or Western Ferries to charter it and to consider operating the catamaran on a route to Mull if it's economical and the market is there, like the commercial service to Orkney?
Well, we're not ferry operators. We're just a users committee. We're not in a position to charter or purchase ferries. As far as I understand it, yes, CMAL certainly did look at the Pentalina, and for a few sort of technical reasons, it wasn't considered great. The biggest disadvantage, although it is a catamaran, it's not perhaps right for our service. Our service is very high frequency, fast turnaround service. You need to be able to turn the ferry around in 15 minutes, unlike the route that the Pentalina was operating to Orkney. So when you need to maintain that 15-minute turnaround, you need ramps at both bow and stern, which the Pentalina does not have. The Pentalina only has ramps at the stern, so loading and unloading is a little too slow for Mull. Basically, that was its major Achilles heel. What we're talking about here is essentially the same thing, but with ramps at the front end. Okay.
I'd like to bring in a couple of points that Peter Brown has raised. It's an observation really. Basing the boat at Creignier would give a much longer service day without increasing crew hours, which would be a massive benefit. But he's asking the question, would it be certified to be able to travel out to Colonsay, Col and Tiree?
Well, that's ultimately can only be answered by the MCA and their assessment of its seakeeping ability. The sellers certainly assure that it is certainly capable of Col, Tiree and Colonsay. Probably not, in the worst weather going to Barra, but it certainly should be able to do Col, Tiree and Colonsay, that or Arran, Ardross and Tobrodick, or Kennecraig to Isla. No problem for those sorts of routes. But that's why, that's a key obstacle to overcome, first of all, is that MCA approval and their assessment of those technical things.
Okay, and I've got another point from Peter, where it's a question. Are two of these catamarans enough to cover 100% of the demand? And if so, he believes that the community should be pushing for this as a first step towards two cat service. I presume what he means there is we should be pushing to get the first catamaran from Indonesia or something similar.
Yes, it could, absolutely. But this is the key thing here is this is an opportunity. This is not a procurement. We're not starting with a blank sheet of paper and going out looking for we're not drawing this from scratch. We're taking advantage. We're asking government to take advantage of a vessel that is available, that is a good exemplar of the type, is an opportunity to test the type and the theory and the principle, demonstrate it on our route. And if it proves to be, as Alf would certainly expect it to be, successful, is that then it's a demonstrator for doing it elsewhere, and a demonstrator for possibly adding a second in the future.
Can I just add to that, Murray, as well? Just what Joe's saying there is totally correct. That it's an opportunity to look at now, but also it's like, if this is not the catamaran that we get, it still has to be, the argument still has to be, but it's a catamaran that we want, and so that a boat that in the future can be built, not necessarily in Indonesia, it can be built in the Clyde or wherever, and it could go out to Column Tyree and it could go out to Barra. It's just this one that might struggle with the MCA. If you started from scratch with the MCA and with naval architects, you'd be going, now, this is what we're going to build. Is it okay? And they'd say, yes, it is okay to build. The only issue is that at the moment this one is in build, and that is where the problem with the MCA comes in. So I don't think we should get too hung up about whether it can go to Col or Tyree, because with a blank sheet of paper, you can go anywhere.
It's maybe worth adding that the designer, Stuart Ballantyne, is a Scotsman. Although he's been based in Australasia for many years, I think he was brought up in Greenock in Port Glasgow. So he's very familiar with the West Coast and sailed around it extensively as well. And his vessels now operate in many countries around the world. And I'm quite sure that if he is proposing this vessel for Mull, it will operate very effectively. It's very similar to a vessel he introduced in Trinidad a couple of years ago, which is operating on quite an exposed route between Trinidad and Tobago. And it's quite similar to the 15 or more vessels, smaller vessels actually, that are now in operation in the Philippines on coastal routes, up and down east and west coast of Philippines. So I'm quite sure this vessel will be very able to handle Oban to Craignaur.
Okay, thank you. We've still got quite a lot of questions to try and get through, and I'm going to try and combine a couple here. There's a point made by Nigel Judson and another question from Terry Hegarty, which I'm going to combine. So if there was a long stay car park in Oban and we were encouraging visitors not to bring their vehicles across, we would need less car carrying capacity on a ferry, and we could stimulate opportunities for local businesses on the island, for local taxis, for local electric car hire, tour guides, etc. So what do the panel variously think of that sort of a suggestion to try to reduce the size of the car carrying capacity? And it does chime with concerns, I think, about higher vehicle carrying capacities discharging 80 or 100 cars onto the single track roads on the island and causing sort of major traffic problems on the island. So there's a few points there kind of rolled into one. So
yeah, certainly. I mean, everybody on the island would agree, I think, that, you know, we don't want the largest of CalMax vessels disgorging, you know, up to 120 cars at one time and blocking our roads. Of course we don't. That you want, that's what, you know, this ferry is not vast. So it's the higher the frequency of sailings, if you can afford to run the ferry longer through the day and offer more sailings and higher frequency, each sailing will naturally be carrying fewer vessels, fewer cars, as well as the capacity of the ferry not being outrageous. But the point about encouraging, so yeah, the point about encouraging use of public transport is absolutely right and laudable. I think one of the benefits of this ferry is that it does make public transport connections easier. I'm not sure how easy it would be to, there's a difference, I think, between making public transport easier for those who rely on and need public transport, and should be encouraged to use it wherever they can. But on the other hand, discouraging people who, particularly thinking of the example of holidaymakers who are coming on holiday and kind of reliant on the motor car for their holiday, discouraging them from being able to cross sort of prohibitively. So it's a different kind of use case, but yeah, hopefully that this ferry meets both issues in that, providing vehicle capacity where it's needed, and also providing a frequency and flexibility to line up and align with public transport connections as well.
Any thoughts on that, Finlay?
Yeah, I agree with Joe. I think that we certainly don't want the big mega loads of 801, 802 sort of style vessels arriving, because it's just too many. If it was full, obviously it's too many cars for the road at any one time. But as Joe says, if you had two, or even, let's be honest, we had three boats going back and forward, then it just spreads it all out. It doesn't necessarily mean less cars, but it means less cars at one time. And definitely I agree with Joe that there are parts of Mull that you can't get to by bus, or certainly regularly by bus, that would certainly require the person who's coming to have a car. I mean, Iona doesn't get the cars across here, but it does have provision for car parking in Finnefort, and certainly knowing a lot of the people that come, they bring a lot of stuff with them. So yeah, it would be great to have that option, free parking in Oban. I think there would be quite a lot of people who would leave their cars if that was an option, but it's not the only way to do it. And certainly, if you imagine at the moment, a lot of the capacity is actually used by islanders. So you've got a lot of like day trippers are already going on buses on Mull. So it's actually a lot of the capacity will be used by deliveries and by islanders ourselves. So reducing the actual capacity in the long run, I don't think is a vote winner.
Good point. Good point. We've got an interesting question here from Mike McKenzie from Easdale. He's asking, do we have support from Argyll and Butte's MSP and MP?
I would say one of the most helpful and supportive people that I have is Mike Russell, our MSP. Has been very helpful and supportive in this. He's actually, I think we'll without making a political point, we will actually miss him in terms of his work. His work rate is quite fantastic. So he's retiring next year, but yes, he is certainly very supportive. And the key thing is pressing this at a political level, a government level, and Mike has been a great help in that.
Yep, I'll echo that as well. So I'm just trying to sift through the remaining questions.
Could I just add something there, Murray?
Please.
Just a point that, in my experience of dealing with ferries policy over many years, ministers obviously have a role to play, but I think the balance of power within government tends to lie more with the officials and the agencies, and whatever they decide tends to hold sway with ministers and with parliamentarians in general. That's just a comment.
Yep. So I've got another point. I think it's a point rather than a question from Ewan Haig. And I think this is chiming very much with the two presentations that we've had this evening. It says that CalMac ferries seem to be designed to meet the wrong figure of merit, deadweight, usually set too high, ! Given the sea area and the weather, the main figure of merit should surely be the minimum ship motions and perceived roll and pitch accelerations. This will reduce cancelled sailings. The optimum ship design will turn out to have less power and lower superstructure. Designing for minimum motions will point to multi-hull solutions. And I think that's really echoing the two presentations that we've already had. So,
but probably saying it more competently than certainly than me.
Certainly more quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the trends we've seen with the ship supplying situation in Scotland is this move towards ever larger vessels, and that's not necessarily what each route necessarily wants, especially when it comes to the key attribute, which is frequency. So there needs to be a reining back of this policy for going for ever larger vessels. This is what's been happening in the wider international shipping sector, say, for example, the North Sea routes or the Baltic routes or the Mediterranean routes, where the motivation is to go for economies of scale. You make the vessel bigger to carry, 3 or 4 freight decks and all the rest of it, 200 trucks, 2,000 people, but that's on different types of routes. For small island routes, it's not a question of economies of scale. It's a question of how do you get the best efficiency and how do you deliver what the users really need. And that's frequency and reliability and enough car spaces that they don't have to compete for car space at peak times, and this way economies can grow if the right balance is provided. So I think we need to move away from this crude analysis of just make the boat bigger, and of course making the boat bigger in confined harbors makes it less reliable because it can't berth, it can't sail in extreme conditions, whereas the lower windage catamaran with the 4 props can do the business. So we need to move away from this very crude methodology, I think, of maximizing the size of the ship unnecessarily. As Joe said, there's not the demand for the 1,000 passengers on practically any of these routes to be carried at one single time.
Okay, we've got quite a good question here. Again, it doesn't show who it's from, but it says, is there a role for automation? For example, artificial intelligence navigation and auto-moor technology to reduce down labor costs?
Alf might know of more examples of this, but certainly, I mean, automatic mooring is a big issue, is increasing in use. Whether it's applicable on our kind of routes in our kind of weather, I don't know. But yes, are there systems for doing that, for mooring automatically? Yes. Are there, in fact, again to draw on Norwegian example, in Norway there are autopilot-driven ferries being deployed, or in the early stages of development. So you would have ferries that would, launch, travel, berth all entirely automatically. But that's for a very sheltered fjord, which is a very different circumstance to our waters. But certainly those technologies are being developed. I don't think that's really what we're talking about here, though.
Any quick thoughts there, Alf?
Not really. I would agree with Joe. I think the issue about unmanned ships has been on the go for a long time, ever since somebody concluded that accidents are caused by human error. So if you take the human dimension out of the equation, you won't have any accidents. But of course, we know that that's not necessarily the case. But I think it's an issue. Automated mooring systems are commonplace now in many areas. But I think the weather conditions and other aspects here means we have to look at that very carefully. I agree with Joe. I don't think it's the key issue here. The key issue is getting the right boats and the right service rotation, the right frequency, the right system in place. That's much more important, and that's what will sustain island communities and actually make island communities prosper and be much more competitive in the wider context.
Yeah, thank you. I've got another question from Terry Hegarty, and I'm very much on board with his point here, that the National Islands Plan should surely afford an opportunity for islanders to have a say in ferry procurement and services, along with the Scottish Government's commitment for community empowerment. And he's making a personal comment at the end saying that cloth ears are unacceptable. And I've had a few people in the comments and questions have been using the phrase cloth ears. So I'm sensing a little bit of frustration that the voices of the community may not be being heard or listened to properly. So any thoughts on that from the panelists?
Absolutely, and this is one of the things that's kind of driving us is knowing that Mull is one of the next islands up for ferry replacement, and seeing how that replacement and procurement process has been handled recently on other islands. You know, leads us to think, well, look, the process has not been great. It hasn't led to the right optimum outcome, particularly when you talk about, you know, ferry size and number of ferries. So recent examples, the Loch Seaforth, which has been deployed to Stornoway, Ullapool Stornoway route in 2015, is this one large ferry solution that the Western Isles Council and other local people at the time very firmly wanted 2 ferries to work that route, for all the reasons that we talked about tonight of flexibility and redundancy. They wanted, the local community in that instance wanted 2 ferries, not 1. But they were delivered 1. And now, as you saw from the chart in my long presentation, is that Ullapool Stornoway, despite being the recipient of the most recent multi-million-pound ferry, they are already, you know, they're second, you know, we're more or less tying with them for the most congested service. So it demonstrates a failure of that strategy, of the one large ferry strategy, that local people did not want. And the same thing is being repeated in the case of these 2 new ferries, A01 and A02, particularly on the Uig Triangle service. The obvious solution there that was advocated by local people was for 2 smaller ferries to run a more flexible, more frequent service. So rather than sharing one large ferry between 2 routes, they wanted 2 ferries that could, you know, would provide internal redundancy on the service, one for the other, and give much more frequency. And again, the community view in that case was, I don't know about overruled or ignored, but certainly wasn't heard. And what is being delivered or will be delivered in 2 or 3 years' time now is one large ferry, and this is that one large ferry solution which is not suitable, and it's the one large ferry solution which we certainly don't want for Mull, for all the reasons we've been talking about. So there needs to be more community involvement, and that's what this is all about. This webinar, all of this work is about getting community engagement in this topic, and on an informed basis, so that people need to understand these dull, dry issues and charts and all the rest of it, but they're important. They have a really fundamental bearing on our life as islanders on the island, and we need to engage with it and convince those decision makers, which are ultimately ministers, government, to make better decisions when it comes to us.
Can I add just a little addition to that? I think the issue about consultation is often raised, that government consults with users and stakeholders and so on, but government then just usually goes on and makes its decision, irrespective quite often of users' comments and observations. So consultation in that sense is a bit of another fallacy, if I might say. The users, in this sense, we have a centralized system which is looking maybe at the ferry network as, in a way, a trunk system, but it's not a trunk system like the Norwegian system partly is. What happens in Norway is there's a split between trunk system and local system. So the trunk road system that's partly connected to the ferries on the trunk road system is dealt by central government, but the islands and the remote communities and other ferry services are delivered locally, and they're tendered locally by local communities, transport authorities, and so on. So and local communities are heavily involved in that. So I think in Scotland, we need to get away from this too heavy. What we have is a very centralized approach. And the local communities really have the better ideas and innovations, as we can see in this example. What your committee has done tonight, and what Joe's work and your colleagues' work has done, is raise a real innovation, if you like. And what we see in Scottish ferry markets is this always comes from island communities, whether it's in Orkney with Pentland Ferries, whether it's the Cowal Peninsula with Western Ferries, and previous to that, Western Ferries in Islay. These innovations come out of island communities themselves, because they see their service provision isn't up to the standard that they need or want. Therefore, it stands to reason that island communities should be central to this whole process of tendering, decision making. And this links into the idea of bundling and debundling, because I've long suggested, and other people like Roy Peterson have suggested, that we need to debundle the routes rather than this whole single bundle where we have this other fallacy of the relief vessel, which maybe exists, maybe it doesn't, but it's highly theoretical most of the time. But as I say, if you have a route with 2 or more vessels, you always have permanent cover. What's the problem? You don't have to plead with somebody for a boat that might be 100 miles away, that might never reach you. You've always got permanent cover. So I think we need to, this links to centralization, decentralization, debundling routes, and also local communities being key to the decision-making process.
Finlay, any final thoughts on community consultation and the National Islands Plan?
I agree wholeheartedly with what the other panelists have said. I don't really think I've got anything I can particularly add to that, other than that it would be great that our voices listened to. It's not that we're sitting here telling everybody that we know everything. We're honestly just trying to put something out there that stimulates the debate, and hopefully some other people are listening. I think Alf said it earlier on that, you know, to change to catamarans, it's a culture shift for the government and for CalMac, and it has to start somewhere, especially if you're not debundling. If it is staying in a big network-wide thing, then yeah, it's not easy to say we now need 25 new catamarans, please. But you have to start somewhere, and I would really like the powers that be to be looking at us and saying, well, you know, there's some merit to this. Let's look at it further.
Yeah, I think just my observation, not on the particular question, but on the way that the question has been answered, is that I haven't been running a stopwatch on the answers, but I think there was more time spent on that last question, answering that last question, and a lot more passion. The fact that there is a degree of frustration that the island communities are not being listened to. And I've just got to, this is going to have to be the final comment in from Peter Brown. As islanders, we need to make a political demand that ferries are based and operated from the islands, hence Craignia Oban, not Oban Craignia. Nothing against Gourock, but it is almost impossible for somebody who lives on the mainland to understand the needs of the islanders, although in their defense, they do try. Over 20 years ago, I attended a transport conference in Sweden, and even then, the Mull representative was campaigning for 2 smaller ferries instead of 1 big one. So this isn't a new phenomenon. All island communities prefer a 2-vessel operation. The only community to keep 2 ferries on the run was Bute, where many CalMac employees live. So that's an interesting perspective.
That's very cynical.
Yeah, there are one or two questions and comments that I've unfortunately run out of time now, because it's just gone 9:30, and I promised everybody that we'd be finished for 9:15. But I've been really pleased to help keep the conversation going. So I'd just like to thank the other 3 panelists, for Alf with his very thought-provoking presentation, and for Joe for his very lengthy, very detailed, very, very thorough presentation. which I know he's put an awful lot of work into over the last year or so. And thanks to Finlay as well, even though we can't see him in person. Thanks to the vagaries of the local broadband system. So I'm going to close down the webinar now and thank everybody for attending, and have a safe evening. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.